cannot feel your
A Navy
fingers.
patrol plane.
You stopped feeling them
Routine
40
patrol.
minutes ago,
Only
somewhere
behind
over
every
the North
cloud
Sea,
may be an enemy.
when the temperature outside dropped to 43 below, and the cold found every gap in your electrically heated suit and settled in for good. You are 19 years old. You weigh 150 pounds. You are kneeling on a bicycle seat at the very back of a B-17 flying fortress, separated from the rest of your crew by 40 feet of aluminum fuselage, and the loudest noise you have ever heard in your life. Your name is Eugene Moran. You grew up on a dairy farm in Wisconsin. A year ago, you had never fired a weapon at another human being. Right now, you are firing at everything that moves. The German fighters have been coming for 11 minutes. FW-190s and BF-109s. You can identify them by silhouette at 2,000 yards. They taught you that in training. They did not teach you what it feels like when 20-millimeter cannon rounds punch through the aluminum inches from your face. You have one mission: protect the bomber's tail. Keep the Germans off the 6 o'clock position. You are doing your job. Then the world ends. The sound arrives before anything else. Not an explosion. Something structural. Something fundamental giving way. And when you look forward through the fuselage of your B-17, it is not there anymore. Eugene Moran was born in 1924 on a dairy farm outside Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin. A small town, the kind of place where everyone knew your name and no one locked their doors. His father worked the land before him. His grandfather worked it before that. The Moran family understood two things well: hard work and cold winters. He grew up watching aircraft pass overhead. Small ones at first, crop dusters banking low over the fields. Then bigger ones, military transports crossing the sky in formations that made the ground tremble slightly if you stood still enough to feel it. He would stop whatever he was doing and watch until they disappeared over the tree line. He never said much about it. Farm boys from Wisconsin did not talk about dreams the way people in the city did. But everyone who knew him noticed the way he watched those planes. On December 7th, 1941, Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor. Eugene Moran was 17 years old. He listened to the radio broadcast with his father in the kitchen and said nothing. On the morning of his 18th birthday, he walked into the nearest Army Air Forces recruiting office and enlisted. They needed gunners. The Army Air Forces were building the most ambitious bombing campaign in the history of warfare. Hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses. Thousands of missions deep into occupied Europe and Germany itself. Each bomber carried 10 men. Each man had a job, and the job that needed filling most urgently. The job that required young men with quick reflexes and steady nerves, and absolutely no fear of enclosed spaces, was aerial gunner. The recruiters looked at Eugene Moran. Farm boy, strong hands, good eyes, used to cold weather and physical discomfort, used to working alone. Perfect. Gunnery school taught him everything the Army thought he needed to know. He learned to track fast-moving targets while compensating for wind speed, altitude, and the velocity of his own aircraft. He learned to fire in short, controlled bursts, 3 to 5 rounds at a time, to prevent his barrels from overheating. He learned aircraft recognition until the silhouettes of enemy fighters were burned into his memory like photographs. The Messerschmitt BTF 109, narrow fuselage, squared wingtips, distinctive chin-mounted supercharger intake, identifiable at 2,000 yards if you knew what to look for. The Focke-Wulf 190, wider body, radial engine, faster than anything the Americans had expected when it first appeared over France in 1941 and began destroying RAF Spitfires at a rate that shocked everyone on the Allied side. Moran memorized them both. He could call them out by name in the dark. What gunnery school could not teach him? What no training program on Earth could adequately prepare anyone for was the reality of combat at altitude over Germany. The cold at 24,000 feet was not the cold of a Wisconsin winter. A Wisconsin winter was uncomfortable, manageable. You wore enough layers and kept moving, and eventually went inside. The cold at 24,000 feet was a different category of experience entirely. The temperature in the tail gunner's compartment could drop to 40 below zero and stay there for hours. Cold that turned exhaled breath into ice crystals on the inside of your oxygen mask within seconds. Cold that seeped through electrically heated flight suits and found every seam and zipper and gap. Cold that killed exposed skin in minutes and damaged it in seconds. Frostbite was not a risk on a B-17 mission. Frostbite was a certainty, if you were not careful. Gunners lost fingers, they lost toes. One man in the 96th Bomb Group lost part of his nose on a mission to Hamburg because he removed his oxygen mask for 40 seconds to clear an obstruction, and the air outside did the rest. The oxygen itself was a problem. At 24,000 feet, the atmosphere held roughly 1/3 of the oxygen available at sea level. Every movement required conscious effort. Lifting an ammunition box felt like lifting it underwater. Swinging the gun mount from one target to another left the lungs burning for air that the mask was already providing at maximum flow. Men passed out if their oxygen lines kinked or froze. They died quietly in their positions if no one noticed in time. And then there was the noise. 4 Wright R1820 Cyclone engines producing a combined 4,800 horsepower. Up to 13 50 caliber Browning machine guns firing simultaneously when a formation was under attack. 20mm cannon shells from German fighters detonating against aluminum fuselage with a sound like a car wreck compressed into a single sharp instant. The interphone system that connected the crew through headsets in their helmets was the only way to communicate, and it was constantly overwhelmed by static and overlapping voices and the specific controlled panic of men trying to report threats from every direction at once. This was the environment Eugene Moran entered when he was assigned to the 96th Bombardment Group at Snetterton Heath in England. The 96th was part of the 8th Air Force, the American strategic bombing force based in Britain. By the autumn of 1943, the 8th Air Force was conducting daylight precision bombing raids against targets deep inside Germany. The theory was straightforward. Destroy the factories that built German aircraft. Destroy the refineries that produced German fuel. Destroy the ball-bearing plants that kept German tanks and aircraft running, hit the industrial foundation of the German war machine hard enough and long enough, and the Wehrmacht would grind to a halt. The reality was more complicated. Germany had built one of the most sophisticated air defense networks in history. Radar installations tracked incoming bomber formations from the moment they crossed the Dutch coast. Fighter control centers vectored Luftwaffe squadrons to intercept points calculated with mathematical precision. Anti-aircraft batteries ringed every significant industrial target with overlapping fields of fire that could place exploding shells at any altitude a bomber could reach. And the Luftwaffe fighter pilots were professionals. These were not young men learning their trade. By November 1943, the core of the German fight force had been fighting continuously since 1939. They had fought over Poland and France and Britain and the Eastern Front. They had developed tactics specifically designed to destroy B-17 formations. They knew the defensive geometry of the bomber boxes. They knew where the blind spots were. They knew which angles minimized their exposure to return fire and maximized the damage their 20mm cannons could inflict in a single pass. The head-on attack from 12 o'clock high, coming directly at the nose of a B-17 at a combined closing speed of over 500 miles per hour, giving the bomber's gunners less than 2 seconds to acquire and engage. The cannon rounds that reached the cockpit from that angle killed pilots and co-pilots and destroyed control systems before anyone in the formation had time to react. The coordinated pair attack from 6 o'clock low. One fighter drawing the tail gunner's attention by feinting from the right, while his wingman lined up the actual killing shot from the left. Simple, effective, lethal to any tail gunner who had not been watching for it specifically and constantly. The 96th Bomb Group had learned these lessons the hard way. By October 1943, the mathematics of survival for a B-17 crew had become a subject that no one discussed openly, because the numbers were too brutal to say out loud. A crew had to complete 25 missions to be rotated home. Statistical analysis of losses across the 8th Air Force showed that the average crew lasted approximately 15 missions before being shot down, killed, or so severely wounded that the crew ceased to exist as a functional unit. Some bomb groups were losing more than half their aircraft every month. The mission to Schweinfurt on October 14th, 1943, had made the reality impossible to ignore. 60 B-17s shot down in a single afternoon. 600 men killed, captured, or scattered across occupied Europe in the time it took to fly to central Germany and back. The 8th Air Force had suspended deep penetration raids into Germany for weeks afterward, while commanders argued about what had gone wrong and what, if anything, could be done differently. What could be done differently, it turned out, was not much. Not until long-range fighter escorts could accompany the bombers all the way to the target and back, and those escorts did not yet exist in sufficient numbers. Eugene Moran knew all of this. Every man in the 96th Bomb Group knew it. They ate breakfast together in the pre-dawn darkness before missions and did not talk about the empty chairs from the day before. They flew their missions and came back and counted who had returned and did not say what they were counting. They were young men doing a job that the mathematics said would probably kill them, and they kept doing it because the alternative was unthinkable. Moran's aircraft was a B-17 Flying Fortress that the crew had named Rikki Tikki Tavi, painted on the nose in the style that bomber crews across the 8th Air Force had adopted, part superstition, part identity, part the human need to give a name to the machine you were trusting with your life. Rikki Tikki Tavi carried 10 men into the sky on the morning of November 29th, 1943. Pilot and co-pilot in the cockpit, navigator and bombardier in the nose compartment below them, surrounded by plexiglass and the best view of everything trying to kill them. Flight engineer in the top turret, directly behind the cockpit, standing in a rotating dome with twin 50 caliber guns pointed at the sky. Radio operator in the fuselage behind the bomb bay, manning a single 50 caliber through a hatch in the roof. 2 waist gunners standing at open windows on either side of the rear fuselage, exposed to the full force of the slipstream. Ball turret gunner curled into a glass sphere beneath the aircraft, suspended over 4 miles of open air. And Eugene Moran in the tail. The tail gunner's position was unlike any other station on the aircraft. It required crawling through the rear fuselage on hands and knees to reach a compartment barely large enough to turn around in. Moran knelt on a padded rest and leaned into a chest plate of steel, his face close to the plexiglass, his hands on the grips of twin 50 caliber Brownings fed by ammunition boxes on either side. The entire station rotated slightly on a yoke system, giving him a field of fire that covered the rear hemisphere of the aircraft. The nearest crewman was the radio operator, 40 feet of fuselage and bomb bay between them. When the interphone worked, Moran could hear all of them. When it went silent, he was the most alone man in the sky. He had occupied that position 23 times before the morning of November 29th. 23 missions. He had watched aircraft go down. He had seen formations absorb catastrophic losses and continue flying because stopping was not an option. He had fired his guns at German fighters and felt the aircraft shudder from impacts that should have brought it down and somehow had not. 23 missions. He needed 25 to go home. This was mission 24. The 8th Air Force dispatched several hundred heavy bombers toward Bremen that morning. The target was the city's industrial complex. Shipyards producing vessels for the Kriegsmarine, aircraft manufacturing facilities, submarine pens sheltering U-boats that were still, in late 1943, threatening Allied shipping lanes across the Atlantic. Bremen was one of the most heavily defended cities in Germany. The flak batteries surrounding it were among the densest concentrations of anti-aircraft artillery in Europe. The Luftwaffe fighter units assigned to the defense of northwestern Germany were experienced and aggressive. Every man in every B-17 crossing the North Sea that morning understood what they were flying toward. They flew toward it anyway. The formations crossed the Dutch coast in tight defensive boxes, each B-17 positioned with precision to provide overlapping fields of fire. pack the bombers close enough together, and their combined firepower created a wall of defensive fire that no fighter could penetrate without taking devastating damage. The theory worked when the formation held together. Moran watched from the tail as the German coast appeared below. Grey-green farmland, visible through breaks in the cloud cover. The flak started minutes later, black bursts appearing in clusters ahead of the formation. The anti-aircraft gunners on the ground were tracking the bombers by radar and placing their shells with accuracy that had improved dramatically since 1942. The explosions were not random. They were calculated. They were placed where the aircraft would be in 3 seconds, not where the aircraft was now. Abe 17, 2 positions ahead in the formation, took a direct flak hit in the right wing. The fuel tank ignited. The aircraft did not explode immediately. It flew on for perhaps 4 seconds with fire streaming from the wing, long enough for Moran to watch it happen with the helpless clarity that combat imposes on the mind. Then the fire reached something critical, and the aircraft folded and fell from the formation and disappeared below the cloud layer. 10 men. The formation closed the gap and continued toward Bremen. Rikki-Tikki-Tavi released its bombs over the target at 11:21 that morning. 4,000 pounds of high explosives tumbling toward the factory complexes below. The bombardier called bombs away over the interphone, and the aircraft lifted slightly as the weight left the bomb bay, that familiar lurch that every crewman recognized as the moment their reason for being there had been accomplished. Now they had to get home. The formation began its turn to the northwest, toward the North Sea, toward England, toward the possibility of survival. 200 miles of hostile airspace between them and safety. 200 miles of Luftwaffe coverage and flak batteries, and the accumulated industrial violence of a nation fighting for its existence. At 11:27, Rikki-Tikki-Tavi's number 2 engine took a direct hit from a flak fragment. The propeller began to windmill, spinning uselessly in the slipstream without power, creating drag instead of thrust. The aircraft began losing airspeed. The pilot pushed the remaining 3 engines harder, but the mathematics were unforgiving. A B-17 with 1 engine out could maintain formation under normal circumstances. A B-17 with 1 engine out and battle damage to its airframe could not. Rikki-Tikki-Tavi began falling behind. The formation moved ahead at 150 miles per hour. Rikki-Tikki-Tavi fell back at 130, then 120. The gap between the last aircraft in the formation and Moran's position in the tail grew from 50 yards to 100 to 200. In the Luftwaffe fighter control centers on the ground, radar operators watched the separation develop on their screens and made a radio call. A straggler, a B-17 alone, without the protection of the formation's massed firepower, was not a threat. It was a target. Luftwaffe fighter units had learned from 4 years of combat that the investment of multiple fighters against a single separated bomber almost always produced a kill. The ratio of cost to result was favorable in a way that attacking a tight formation not. Multiple waves of FW-190s and BF-109s turned toward Rikki-Tikki-Tavi. In the nose section, Navigator Jesse Orison tracked their approach on the interphone, calling positions for the gunners. 12 o'clock level, 3 o'clock high, 6 o'clock low. In the tail, Eugene Moran heard the last call and pressed his shoulders against the steel chest plate and put his hands on the grips of his twin, 50 calibers, and waited. They came from the 6 o'clock low position first, exactly where doctrine said they would, rising from below and behind, angling for the most vulnerable approach, counting on the tail gunner's field of fire being limited at extreme depression angles. Moran swung his guns down as far as the mount allowed and opened fire. The tracers asked downward in a stream that the leading FEW 190 flew directly through. The German pilot broke left and rolled away, his attack aborted. His wingman came from the right. Moran swung the mount and fired again. The second fighter climbed away without pressing its attack. More came. They always came in waves. One pair drawing fire while another pair set up the actual attack vector. Moran had been taught about this tactic, knowing about it and defending against it alone, with no other gunners covering his flanks, were entirely different problems. He swung from target to target. Brass casings poured from the ejection ports and piled around his knees. The barrels of his guns heated with each burst. The smell of cordite filled the compartment. Through the plexiglass, he could see traces coming from multiple directions, the geometry of the attack visible in the lines of light converging on Ricky Tikik Tavi from every angle. The top turret gun fell silent. Then one waist gun. Then the other. Moran did not know what had happened forward of his position. The interphone was fragmenting, voices cutting in and out over static that grew worse with each passing second. He heard Orison's voice once, calling a fighter position from the nose, then nothing. He kept firing. A FW 190 came in from the 4 o'clock position during a banking turn, cutting across Moran's field of fire. He tracked it, leading the target the way training had taught him, and pressed the triggers. The fighter's left wing disintegrated at the root. The aircraft rolled inverted and fell away, trailing black smoke. His first confirmed kill. He did not have time to register it. 20mm cannon rounds tore through the tail section in a burst that lasted less than a second and felt like an hour. Something hit his left forearm, then his right. The pain arrived immediately, sharp and specific, the kind of pain that the body registers as structural damage. Blood soaked through his flight suit sleeves and began to freeze in the cold. His hands still worked. He kept firing. More rounds struck the vertical stabilizer above him. Control cables snapped and whipped through the air. The tail section began vibrating with a frequency that had not been there before, a structural resonance that Moran could feel in his teeth and his knees, and the steel chest plate pressed against his chest. Something was wrong with the aircraft. Not engine wrong or fuel wrong. Something deeper, something that involved the airframe itself. He looked down at his parachute, the canvas pack strapped to his chest, his only way out if the bomber went down. Multiple holes. Cannon rounds had punched through the fabric at several points. The silk canopy inside was shredded. Eugene Moran was flying over Germany under attack in a damaged aircraft with a destroyed parachute and blood freezing on both forearms and the German fighters were still coming. He put his hands back on the guns, because there was nothing else to do, because the tail was his position, and the position had to be held, because 8 other men on this aircraft were depending on the rear hemisphere being covered, and he did not yet know how many of them were still alive, because he was 19 years old, and he had not yet learned how to stop. The attack continued. The fighters made pass after pass, each one probing for the angle that would deliver a killing blow. Rikki-tikki-tavi absorbed the impacts and flew on, bleeding altitude and airspeed. The 3 remaining engines, straining against the combined drag of battle damage and the useless windmilling propeller on number 2. Moran counted what he could count. Tracers, attack angles, barrel temperature, ammunition remaining. He did not count the silences from the crew positions ahead of him. He could not afford to. At 11:31, a cannon burst struck something in the forward fuselage that Moran could not see. The aircraft lurched. A sound traveled through the airframe that he had never heard before on 23 previous missions. Low, grinding. The sound of something being stressed beyond its design limits. The vibration intensified. At 11:32, the fuselage of Rikki-tikki-tavi split apart just forward of the tail section, and Eugene Moran watched the front of his B-17 fall away from him. The cockpit, the wings, the engines, the bomb bay, the radio compartment, the ball turret, all of it separating and tumbling toward the German countryside, 4 miles below. All of it taking with it the men who had sat in those positions since before dawn that morning. The pilot, the co-pilot, the flight engineer, the radio operator, the ball turret gunner, the 2 waist gunners, 7 men, gone in the time it took to blink. Jesse Orison, the navigator, had bailed out from the nose section in the final seconds before the split, according to his later testimony. His parachute carried him down toward German fields and captivity and survival. He would spend the rest of the war as a prisoner. He would come home. He would spend decades trying to find words for what he had witnessed in those final moments aboard the aircraft. But Moran did not know any of that yet. What Moran knew was this. He was alone, in the severed tail section of a destroyed B-17 flying fortress. Wounded in both arms, his parachute destroyed. 24,000 feet above Germany. Falling, and the German fighters were still circling. The tail section fell. Not straight down. Not the way a stone falls when you drop it into still water. The severed tail of Rikki-tikki-tavi tumbled and rotated as it dropped, the vertical stabilizer and horizontal stabilizers catching the air at odd angles, creating drag, creating resistance, turning what should have been a straight plummet into something that moved more like a leaf than a stone. The physics of it were accidental. No one designed a B-17 tail section to survive separation from the rest of the aircraft. No engineer at Boeing had drawn up specifications for this scenario. But the stabilizers were large, and they were catching air, and they were slowing the descent in a way that was insufficient to save Eugene Moran's life, and just barely sufficient to delay his death. He had perhaps 2 or 3 minutes. The G-forces from the rotation pressed him against the steel chest plate, then threw him toward the ceiling, then pressed him down again, as the wreckage changed its orientation in the air. His wounded arms slammed against the gun mount. The pain was significant, and he registered it the way a man registers pain when he has decided that pain is not the most important thing happening to him right now. The German fighters were still there. He could see them through the gaps in the torn aluminum where the fuselage had separated. W-190s and BF-19s circling the falling wreckage, the way hawks circle something dying on the ground below. Some of them were pulling alongside to look, perhaps confirming the kill, perhaps trying to understand what they were seeing. A severed tail section falling 4 miles over Germany was not something Luftwaffe pilots encountered on a routine basis. They came closer. Moran grabbed his guns. The spinning of the tail section made aiming a technical impossibility in any formal sense of the word. The guns pointed in one direction and then another as the wreckage rotated, and the fighters moved through his field of fire in unpredictable arcs, and the G-forces pressing against his body made it difficult to hold the grips with arms that were bleeding through 2 layers of frozen fabric. None of that mattered. He pressed the triggers. Tracer rounds asked outward from the falling tail section in wild curving lines that traced the rotation of the wreckage against the gray German sky. The geometry was chaotic. The physics were against him. The probability of hitting anything was low, and he fired anyway because the alternative was to let go of the guns, and he was not going to do that. The German pilots scattered. Whatever they had expected from the wreckage of a destroyed B-17, it was not this. A man in a falling coffin shooting back at them with everything he had left. The FW-190s broke away and climbed. The BF-109s rolled and dove. One Messerschmitt pulled too close and caught a burst across its fuselage. The pilot broke hard left and dove toward the ground, trailing a thin line of smoke. The wreckage fell through 18,000 feet, then 15,000, then 12,000. At lower altitudes, the air thickened enough to breathe without the mask providing full flow, but Moran kept it on. His wounded arms had soaked through their sleeves completely. The wound on his right arm had begun to freeze over, which slowed the bleeding and increased the damage simultaneously. He kept his hands on the grips. Through the torn opening, where the fuselage had separated, he could see the German countryside below. It had been an abstraction at 24,000 feet, a patchwork of gray and brown shapes that could have been a map in a classroom. At 10,000 feet, it was becoming real. Fields, tree lines, roads cutting between farms, a river catching the winter light in the distance. The ground was no longer a concept. It was a destination. The stabilizers were doing something that Moran had no technical language to describe and no time to analyze. The horizontal stabilizer was generating lift at certain angles of rotation. The vertical stabilizer was creating drag that slowed the tumbling. Together, they were giving the tail section an aerodynamic character that was crude and unstable and wholly inadequate for any normal definition of controlled flight, and just barely enough to mean the difference between impact at 200 miles per hour and impact at something less. The tail section passed through 5,000 feet. The German fighters had broken off. The sky around Moran was empty now, except for the clouds and the cold and the ground coming up fast. He looked at his guns one last time. Then he let go of the grips. He wrapped his wounded arms around the ammunition boxes, bolted to either side of the gun mount. The metal was cold enough to burn through his gloves. He pressed his back against the steel chest plate and bent his knees and put his feet flat against the interior wall and held on to the only solid things within reach. The tail section struck the top of a pine tree at high speed. The impact was not a single event. It was a sequence. The vertical stabilizer caught the uppermost branches first, and the resistance tore it partially away from the airframe. The main structure of the tail section drove downward through the canopy, branches snapping against the aluminum with sounds like rifle shots. The wreckage decelerating with each impact, shedding velocity into the forest, the way a car sheds velocity against a barrier, violently and without grace, but with measurable effect. The tail section hit a second trunk, spun sideways. The remaining piece of the horizontal stabilizer caught on a branch thick as a man's thigh and tore free. The wreckage cartwheeled through the lower canopy in a series of impacts that Moran experienced as a continuous explosion of force from different directions, each one slamming him against a different surface of the compartment. His head struck the steel framework above him. The world went white. His left arm bent in a direction that arms are not designed to bend. Then his right. The tail section hit the frozen ground. Silence. Not the silence of a quiet place. The silence that follows catastrophic noise. The silence that arrives when everything that was making sound has stopped simultaneously. The silence of a forest after something terrible has passed through it. Eugene Moran was on the ground. He knew this because he could feel pain in more locations than he had previously believed possible in a single human body. Both forearms were broken, not cleanly. The bones had fractured in multiple places under the combined force of cannon impacts and crash impact and the physics of a body being thrown repeatedly against metal surfaces. Compound fractures. The kind where bone does not stay where bone is supposed to stay. His ribs had absorbed the final impacts against the chest plate. Several of them had given way. Each breath he attempted was accompanied by a grinding sensation and a pain that started in his chest and radiated through his entire torso. The wound on his head was the worst. A piece of the steel framework had connected with his skull during the final health impact sequence and torn through the skin and the bone beneath it. He could feel the cold air on something that should not be exposed to cold air. He did not reach up to check what it was. Some things you do not need to confirm with your hands. He was alive. He was on the ground. He was in Germany. Those were the facts available to him. He tried to move his arms. His left arm responded partially, and the pain from the attempt was severe enough to make his vision contract. His right arm moved slightly less. Neither hand was capable of gripping anything. He used his legs, slowly, with the kind of deliberate, controlled effort that severe pain demands when the alternative is unconsciousness. He moved himself toward the opening in the tail section, where the fuselage had separated, the torn aluminum edge of it, jagged and frost-covered, the opening roughly the size of a doorway into a destroyed room. He pulled himself through it and onto the frozen ground. The forest around him was a pine forest. the trees tall and close together, their canopy broken where the tail section had come through. Grey, December light filtered down through the gaps. His breath steamed in the air. The wreckage of Rikki Tikki Tavi's tail section lay in a shallow furrow carved in the frozen soil, surrounded by broken branches and pieces of aluminum shed during the descent through the canopy. He lay on his back and looked up at the hole in the trees he had fallen through. He was 19 years old, and he had just fallen the better part of 4 miles inside a piece of a destroyed aircraft without a parachute and survived the impact. And he was lying in a German forest, unable to move, with partially exposed to the freezing air, and the rational part of his mind, the part that was still functioning with something approaching clarity, understood that surviving the fall was not the same as surviving. Hypothermia would kill him within hours. The temperature on the ground was well below freezing, and he was lying on frozen soil with blood soaking through his flight suit. In multiple locations, shock was already pulling at the edges of his consciousness. The body's response to catastrophic injury, the physiological retreat that looks like calm and leads to death. His wounds would kill him within a day if untreated. Compound fractures in both forearms in a freezing environment. The head wound, the exposed tissue. Infection would set in within hours. Infection that far north in Germany in December 1943 meant death, because the medications that could fight it were not available in sufficient quantities even for German soldiers, let alone for an enemy airman found in a forest roughly 10 miles south of Bremen. He heard voices, German voices, somewhere in the trees, moving toward him. The crash of the tail section through the forest canopy would have been audible for miles in every direction. He had been heard. They were coming. Moran lay still on the frozen ground and waited. The soldiers emerged from the trees in a group. Wehrmacht infantry, rifles up, moving carefully toward the wreckage. They saw the American in the snow and stopped. A short exchange of words among them. One of them moved forward and crouched near Moran and looked at his wounds with an expression that Moran would later describe as the expression of a man who has seen something he did not expect to see alive. They searched him, his dog tags, his rank insignia, his ruined parachute, the standard procedure for captured airmen, executed with efficiency, if not with gentleness. Moving his arms produced sounds from Moran that he could not control, and the soldiers did not stop to acknowledge. An officer arrived within the hour. He looked at Moran's wounds and said something to the soldiers in German. His tone was flat, clinical. He was not describing a man who required urgent medical care. He was describing a situation that required a decision. The decision was to move him. They loaded him onto a wooden cart, the kind used for hauling farm equipment on unpaved roads. No stretcher, no medical supplies. The cart was pulled along frozen roads that had not been maintained for anything smoother than military truck traffic, and every joint and crack in the surface transmitted directly through the wooden planks into Moran's broken body. He drifted in and out of consciousness during the journey. When he was conscious, he noted details without understanding their significance. The color of the sky, the sound of the horse, the shape of farmhouses passing in his peripheral vision, the cold that was becoming something He no longer felt as cold, but simply as absence, the absence of warmth, the absence of sensation from his extremities. They delivered him to a German military facility, a converted building of some kind. Stone floors, low ceilings, the smell of disinfectant that had not been used recently enough. They put him on the floor, and they left him there. No doctor came, no medic. No one brought water, or morphine, or bandages. The facility was understaffed and under-resourced, and Eugene Moran was an enemy airman who had spent the morning dropping bombs on German factories and German workers and German neighborhoods, and the men responsible for this facility had made a calculation about the allocation of scarce medical resources, and Moran had not come out well in that calculation. He lay on the concrete floor for 2 days. The infection that set in was aggressive in the way that infections are aggressive when they encounter a body that has been through what Moran's body had been through. The compound fractures in both forearms provided direct pathways for bacteria. The head wound provided another. His immune system was responding, but responding to multiple simultaneous crises in a body that had already spent its reserve surviving the fall. By the end of the second day, his forearms had begun to change color in ways that experienced medics recognized as the early stages of a process that ended with amputation. The wound on his head had swollen. His temperature was climbing. On the third day, they moved him again. This time, the destination was a prisoner of war hospital, a building that had been converted to hold wounded Allied airmen until they recovered sufficiently to be transferred to permanent camps. The German military doctors who performed triage on incoming prisoners worked quickly and without sentiment. They categorized wounds by survivability and directed resources accordingly. Wounds that were survivable received treatment. Wounds that were not survivable received a different kind of attention. Moran's wounds, as presented on the third day after the crash, placed him firmly in the second category. There were 2 other physicians in that hospital, Allied medical officers who had been captured and pressed into service treating wounded prisoners because pressing captured physicians into service freed German doctors for higher priority patients. They were not operating under orders when they approached Moran's case. No German officer directed them to save the American tail gunner. They made the decision themselves as physicians, for the reason that physicians make such decisions when they are allowed to be physicians rather than prisoners. Because he was wounded and they were doctors, they examined him with the thoroughness that the situation demanded and the urgency that the timeline required. Both forearms needed immediate surgical intervention to address the compound fractures and the advancing infection. The head wound needed to be cleaned and covered. The ribs needed stabilization. All of this needed to happen in a facility that had been designed for something else, using equipment that had been gathered rather than supplied with anesthetic resources that were insufficient for what the surgery actually required. They operated for 7 hours. The anesthetic they had access to was local. It numbed the immediate surgical site without addressing the broader experience of having your broken arm bones set with metal pins and wire while you were conscious enough to understand what was happening. Moran drifted in and out of awareness during the procedure, the pain pulling him toward consciousness, and the blood loss pulling him back from it, in a cycle that the physicians monitored and managed as best they could. They set the bones in both forearms with whatever metal was available for the purpose. They cleaned the infected tissue from the wound sites with the methodical thoroughness of men who understood that inadequate cleaning now meant death later. They addressed the head wound with a piece of metal plate fitted over the exposed area and secured with available materials. A repair that was crude by any standard and functional by the only standard that mattered in that room on that day. They splintered his arms with wooden boards wrapped in strips of sheeting. When it was over, they told him what they knew. His body had to fight the remaining infection without significant pharmaceutical assistance. His bones had to begin the process of knitting together. The tissue around his head wound had to close over the plate they had placed there. None of these things were guaranteed. All of them were necessary. The next 72 hours would determine whether their 7 hours of work had been sufficient. The fever arrived the first night. It climbed to 104 degrees and stayed there. His body shook with the violent rhythmic chills that accompany high fever, the muscles contracting and releasing in an involuntary attempt to generate heat, the effort exhausting resources that were already critically depleted. The physicians monitored his temperature and changed the cloths on his forehead, and forced water between his lips when he was conscious enough to swallow. There were no antibiotics. What existed in that hospital, in terms of pharmaceutical resources, was not sufficient for what was happening in Moran's bloodstream. The infection was systemic. It had moved from the wound sites into his blood, and his blood was carrying it throughout his body. And the only thing that was going to stop it was his own immune system operating in a body that had been through more in the past 4 days than most human bodies experience in a lifetime. The second night was worse. He called out for his mother. He shouted warnings to crewmen who were already dead. He relived the moment of the split, his voice describing what he was seeing in fragmented phrases that the other patients in the ward could hear clearly, and the physicians listened to with the specific attention of men trying to monitor neurological function in a patient with a head wound. They sat with him in shifts, not because orders required it, because he was alone in a foreign country with catastrophic injuries and a fever that was trying to kill him, and sitting with a man in that condition was a thing that human beings do for each other when they are paying attention to what being human actually requires. On the third morning, the fever broke. The temperature dropped over the course of 2 hours. The shivering stopped. The delirium receded. Moran opened his eyes and saw a ceiling, and understood that it was a ceiling, and knew approximately where he was. The physicians examined him within the hour. The infection had not been eliminated, but it had been contained. His immune system had fought the systemic spread to a standstill. The tissue around the head wound showed the first indicators of closure. The bones in his arms were in the earliest stages of the process that would take months to complete. He was going to live. The word moved through the hospital ward in the way that significant information moves through confined spaces. The American who had fallen 4 miles. the tail gunner who had kept shooting as his bomber disintegrated around him, the man who should have died before he hit the ground and had somehow failed to do so. German guards came to look at him. Other Allied prisoners asked to hear the story. Even the facility's administrators seemed to find the situation notable, the way people find notable any outcome that falls sufficiently far outside the range of expected results. Moran lay in his bunk and healed. It took 6 weeks before he could walk without assistance. His arms remained in their wooden splints. The metal plate in his skull produced headaches that arrived without warning and stayed for hours. His ribs reminded him of their condition every time he drew a breath deep enough to be useful. But he was mobile, and in the German prisoner of war system, mobile meant transferable. They processed him with the efficiency that the system demanded. Name, rank, serial number, service branch, unit. They photographed him against a plain wall. A thin, young man with hollow eyes and bandaged arms who looked directly into the camera with an expression that contained no particular emotion because he had spent all of his available emotion on the preceding 6 weeks and had not yet had time to generate more. The photograph went into a file. The file went into a system, and Eugene Moran went into Stalag Lift 4. The camp was in Pomerania, in what is now northern Poland. A compound built specifically to hold captured Allied airmen. Barbed wire perimeter fences, guard towers at regular intervals with searchlights and machine guns. Wooden barracks constructed to house more men than their designers had intended, which was a characteristic shared by every prisoner of war facility in Germany by late 1943. Thousands of men lived inside the wire. American and British airmen, pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners, men who had been shot down over France and Holland and Belgium and Germany itself, men who had been in the camp for years and men who had arrived the previous week, all of them waiting for a war to end, all of them existing inside the specific psychological work that long-term captivity constructs in the human mind, a framework built from routine and small victories and the disciplined suppression of the awareness that the future is entirely outside your control. The prisoners organized themselves. It was what military men did when the military structure that gave their lives shape was suddenly removed. They maintained rank and discipline. They established systems for the distribution of food and the resolution of disputes. They created a library from books that arrived through the Red Cross. They held classes. A man who had been an engineer before the war taught mathematics. A man who had been a teacher before the war taught German, which was both practical and somewhat darkly ironic under the circumstances. They built a radio, hidden from the guards with ingenuity that had been refined by thousands of men over months of practice. BBC broadcasts came through it in fragments, and the fragments were assembled and circulated through the camp in whispers. The war was still going. The Allies were advancing in Italy. The Soviets were pushing from the east. Rations at Stalag Luft 4 were minimal by the standards of nutritional science and generous by the standards of what Germany could provide to prisoners in the winter of 1943 and 1944. Thin soup, black bread, potatoes when they were available. Red Cross packages arrived periodically and supplemented the diet with tinned meat and chocolate and cigarettes that served as currency for everything else. Most men lost weight steadily. Moran, who had already lost significant mass during his 6 weeks in the prisoner hospital, lost more. His body was still repairing itself, and repairing a body requires resources, and the resources available inside Stalag Luft 4 were not equal to the task. His arms healed improperly, the bones knitted in positions that were close to correct, but not correct enough to fully restore the strength and range of motion that they had possessed before November 29th. In cold weather, which in Pomerania was most weather, they ached with a persistence that became part of the permanent background noise of his existence. The metal plate in his skull conducted temperature. In winter, it conducted cold directly into the tissue surrounding his brain. The headaches this produced were different from ordinary headaches in the way that a structural problem is different from a maintenance problem. They arrived with physical force, and they did not respond to the limited remedies available inside a prisoner of war camp. He lived with them, because that was the only option. Navigator Jesse Orison was in the camp. He had been captured after his parachute brought him down into German-held territory on the same morning that Rikki Tikki Tavi broke apart over Bremen. He had spent weeks being processed through the German system before arriving at Stalag Luft 4. When he found Moran in the camp, the reunion carried the specific weight of two men who had shared the worst morning of their lives from opposite ends of the same aircraft and had each privately assumed the other was dead. Orison had seen Moran still in the tail position in the seconds before he bailed out from the nose. He had watched as German fighters continued to make passes at the aircraft. He had not seen the split. He had been in the air on his parachute by then, drifting toward German fields, watching the pieces of Rikki Tikki Tavi fall in different directions. He had assumed Moran was gone. They did not discuss it at length. Men who have been through what they had been through do not always find that language is adequate to the task of discussing it. They shared a barracks, and they were alive, and that was enough. In the summer of 1944, the Germans began moving prisoners. The Soviets were advancing from the east. The Allied invasion of Normandy had succeeded, and American and British forces were moving through France. Germany was being compressed. The prisoner of war system, built when Germany had the resources and the territorial extent to support it, was beginning to strain under conditions it had not been designed to handle. Moran was transferred, then transferred again, then again. The transfers involved cattle cars, rail cars designed to carry livestock that were loaded with 60 or 70 men and sealed and sent across occupied Europe with the efficiency and the humanity of a logistics operation that had stopped thinking of its cargo as human somewhere in the administrative process. No room to sit, no sanitation, no food, no water. 3 days, 4 days. The specific misery of it was total and unrelieved, and Moran absorbed it the way he had absorbed everything else since November 29th, which was to say, he experienced it fully. and he did not stop moving forward. The worst transfer was by sea. An aging cargo vessel crossing the Baltic, prisoners packed into the hold below deck. A space with no light and no ventilation and one bucket designated for sanitation, needs that 200 men could not adequately address. The hold was sealed. The ship began to move. The crossing took 4 days. What happened in that hold during those 4 days was the kind of experience that the human mind files in a location separate from ordinary memory. A location where it can be accessed, but where the full sensory reality of it has been partially processed into something bearable. Men became ill. Men became irrational. Men died, and their bodies remained in the hold because there was nowhere else to put them. And the living had no capacity to address the situation of the dead, because the living were fully occupied with the situation of the living. When the hatch opened on the 4th day, Moran climbed into grey Baltic daylight with the other survivors and breathed open air for the first time in 4 days. His clothes were soaked. His body had shed more weight it could not afford to lose. Another camp, more wire, more guard towers, more thin soup and black bread, and the slow calendar of captivity grinding forward, 1 day at a time. The autumn of 1944 gave way to winter. The BBC fragments coming through the hidden radio described Allied armies fighting through the Siegfried Line. Soviet forces pressing toward the Vistula, Germany contracting from every direction. The war was ending. Everyone in Stalag Luft 4 could hear it in the distant artillery that had begun to be audible on clear days, could see it in the faces of the German guards, who had possessed a certain confidence in the early months that had been replaced by something more complicated, could feel it in the slight but measurable change in the way the camp administrators conducted themselves. The war was ending, but it had not ended yet. And on February 6th, 1945, the administrators of Stalag Luft 4 informed the prisoners that they were leaving. Soviet forces were approaching from the east. German commanders had ordered the evacuation of all prisoner-of-war facilities in the path of the Soviet advance. The prisoners would march west, on foot. The distance was unspecified. The duration was unspecified. The destination was unspecified. The temperature outside was 20 degrees below zero. Many men had no winter coats. Many had no gloves adequate to the temperature. Many had no boots designed for extended marching in snow and ice. They had been on starvation rations for months. Their bodies had spent the preceding year repairing damage and fighting illness with resources that had never been adequate to the task. They were going to march across Germany in the worst winter in decades. Anyone who refused would be shot. Anyone who fell behind would be shot. The column assembled in the frozen compound at first light. Thousands of Allied airmen, American and British, men who had been pilots and navigators and bombardiers and gunners, and who were now simply men in inadequate clothing, waiting in 20 below temperatures, waiting to be told to move. Eugene Moran stood in that column, both arms still weak from the improper healing, the metal plate in his skull conducting the cold directly into his brain with a persistence that produced a continuous low-grade pain that sharpened whenever the wind changed direction. His ribs still moving, in ways that reminded him of their condition every time he drew a breath. He was 20 years old, and he had lost the better part of 40% of his body mass since the morning he had knelt in the tail of Rikki-Tikki-Tavi and watched German fighters swarm toward his bomber. The guards raised their rifles, and the column began to move, and Eugene Moran put one foot in front of the other on the frozen road. They called it the Black March. Not at the time. At the time it had no name. It was simply the thing that was happening to them, the thing they were inside of. The frozen road and the column of men and the guards with rifles walking alongside, and the snow that fell on some days, and the wind that came on other days, and the cold that came on every day without exception. The name came later, when survivors tried to describe it to people who had not been there and found that ordinary language was insufficient and that the only way to convey its character was to call it what it was: a march in winter, through a country that was dying, through conditions that killed men daily and that continued regardless of who died because the column had to keep moving. 86 days, approximately 600 miles, an estimated 1,500 American and British airmen died during the Black March. Pneumonia, dysentery, typhus that spread through the column in waves as men weakened and their immune systems lost the capacity to hold infections at the perimeter. Frostbite that progressed to gangrene when there was no medical intervention available, and there was almost never medical intervention available. Men who fell in the snow and did not get up, and whose bodies were left at the side of the road because the column had to keep moving, and guards who sometimes waited and guards who sometimes did not. Moran walked. The days established a rhythm that had nothing to do with normalcy and everything to do with survival. Wake before dawn in whatever barn or field or ruined building the column had stopped in the night before. Eat whatever had been issued or stolen or found. Form up on the road. Walk 15 miles on a good day. 20 miles if the guards were pushing the pace and the road was clear of snow. Less on the days when the blizzards came in from the east and reduced visibility to a few yards, and the column slowed to something barely distinguishable from standing still. The cold was consistent. 20 degrees below zero was the baseline. It dropped further on clear nights when the wind came down from the north and found every gap in every inadequate coat worn by every man in the column. Men lost toes to frostbite and pressed on because stopping was not an option. Men lost fingers and pressed on because stopping was not an option. Moran's arms ached in the cold with a constancy that he had stopped registering as pain in any active sense and had begun registering as simply a characteristic of his existence. The way a man registers the sound of traffic if he lives near a highway for long enough. The metal plate in his skull conducted the cold into his brain. The headaches this produced had become familiar. They were always there. They varied in intensity. He had learned which positions reduced them slightly and which movements made them worse. And he managed them the way you manage something permanent, not by solving it, but by learning its character. He was 20 years old, and he was learning the character of permanent pain. The food situation on the march was a mathematical problem with no clean solution. The German supply system that was supposed to provision the column was operating in a country whose logistics infrastructure was being systematically destroyed by Allied bombing. Trains that were supposed to carry supplies did not always arrive. Trucks that were supposed to meet the column at designated points were not always there. The soup that was issued when soup was available was thin in a way that described optimism rather than nutrition. Men ate raw potatoes pulled from frozen fields when they passed through farming country. They ate turnips. They ate things they would not have food 6 months earlier, and that their bodies processed with diminishing efficiency as the march continued and their physical reserves fell below levels that the human body was designed to sustain. There was nothing to be done about this. There was nothing to be done about most of what was happening. The only variable under any individual man's control was whether he put his next foot down. Everything else was outside the wire, outside the column, outside the reach of any decision he could make. So he walked. Around him, men died in various ways and at various speeds. The pneumonia deaths were the fastest among the sick. A man would develop a cough, and within a week, the cough would have become something that occupied his entire chest, and within another week, he would be unable to continue, and then he would be gone. The dysentery deaths were slower and more degrading. The typhus deaths had their own particular character, the fever and the delirium, the rapid collapse of a body that had already been running on reserves it did not have. Moran witnessed all of it and pressed forward, not because he was indifferent to what he was watching, because the alternative was to join them, and he was not going to do that. He had not survived a 4-mile fall from the sky in a severed piece of a destroyed aircraft to die on a frozen road in Germany. He had not endured 7 hours of surgery without adequate anesthesia to freeze to death in a barn in Pomerania. He had not survived the hell ship crossing and 17 months behind the wire to surrender to a march. He was going home. He did not say this out loud. Men on the Black March did not generally make proclamations about their intentions, because the gap between intention and outcome was demonstrably wide, and the road behind them was marked with evidence of that gap. But the decision existed inside him with a solidity that the cold and the hunger and the pain and the exhaustion could not reach. He was going home. The weeks accumulated. February gave way to March. The column moved through a Germany that was coming apart at its seams. They passed through towns where the bombing had been recent enough that the rubble was still smoking. They passed through villages where the civilian population watched them from doorways with expressions that contained no single readable emotion. They passed through stretches of countryside that looked as they must have looked for centuries, farms and forests and frozen rivers, the war visible only in the absence of young men working the fields. The artillery grew louder with each passing week, not the distant rumble that had been audible in the final weeks at Stalag Luft. 4. Closer. The specific sound of artillery fire when you are close enough to hear the outgoing and the incoming as separate events rather than as a single continuous rumble. The men in the column heard it and did not speak about what it meant, because speaking about it felt like the kind of thing that attracted bad luck. But they heard it and they knew what it meant, and it changed something in the way they moved. The guards heard it too. The change in the guards was subtle at first, and then less subtle. Men who had maintained rigid military bearing through the first weeks of the march began to carry themselves differently. The rifles were still present. The orders were still given. But something had shifted in the fundamental relationship between the men giving orders and the men receiving them, a shift that happened when the orders stopped being backed by the certainty that the world would continue to be organized in the way that made those orders meaningful. April came. The snow receded from the roads. The temperature rose to levels that were merely cold rather than lethal. The column continued, but the pace had changed, become less organized, the guards' attention less absolute. Information moved through the column in fragments. American forces were crossing the Elbe. British forces were north of Hamburg. The German command structure was fragmenting. The war was not ending. The war had ended. It was just finishing. On April 26th, 1945, vehicles appeared on the road ahead of the column. American vehicles, jeeps and trucks, and the specific visual language of the United States Army moving through territory it had just taken. Soldiers in American uniforms encountering a column of thousands of men in the road and stopping to determine what they were looking at. The German guards looked at the American vehicles and looked at each other and laid their rifles on the ground. The column stopped. The men in the column stood on the road and looked at the American soldiers getting out of the jeeps and looked at the German rifles on the ground and did not immediately understand what had happened, or rather, they understood it intellectually, but the emotional comprehension of it took longer to arrive, the way your eyes adjust to light after a long time in darkness. They were free. Eugene Moran stood on that road in Germany on April 26th, 1945, and he was free. He weighed 93 pounds. He had weighed 150 pounds. On the morning of November 29th, 1943, when he had eaten powdered eggs for breakfast at Snetterton Heath and checked his oxygen mask and tested his electrically heated suit and climbed into the tail of Rikki Tikki Tavi for the 24th time. 17 months, 57 pounds, both arms broken and improperly healed, a metal plate in his skull, ribs that had never fully recovered, a body that had been through things that bodies are not designed to go through, and had continued to function through all of them on the basis of something that was not physical, something that the Army's medical personnel who processed the liberated prisoners tried to measure with their charts and their scales and their stethoscopes, and found that their instruments were not calibrated for it. The medical teams worked through the liberated column with the urgency that the situation required. Typhus had spread widely during the march. Pneumonia was common. Frostbite had advanced to gangrene in a number of cases that required immediate surgical intervention. Men who had been walking on legs that should not have been walked on were finally permitted to stop and collapsed when the permission was given. Moran was transported to a field hospital, then to a larger facility, then, eventually, to a hospital in England where doctors with access to the full resources of Allied military medicine could look at what had happened to his body and assess what could be repaired and what could not. The metal plate in his skull could not be improved upon under current surgical conditions. It would remain. The headaches it produced would remain. His arms had healed in positions that could be partially corrected, but not fully corrected. The strength in both hands would be permanently reduced. His ribs had healed adequately. His weight would return if he ate enough, and the army was prepared to ensure that he ate enough. The army processed his service record with growing attention to its contents. Shot down over Bremen, November 29th, 1943. Aircraft destroyed by enemy action. Tail section separated from fuselage at 24,000 feet. Airman fell the better part of 4 miles in severed tail section without functional parachute. Survived impact. Captured by enemy forces. Held as prisoner of war for 17 months. Survived forced march of approximately 600 miles in winter conditions. Military historians who examined the record confirmed what the record described. Among the very few Allied airmen documented to have survived falls of comparable distance, Moran's case stood as one of the most complete in terms of corroborating evidence. All such cases involved wreckage from destroyed aircraft that slowed the descent enough to make survival physically possible. All were considered to fall outside the expected range of human experience. The army awarded him 2 Purple Hearts, one for each arm shattered by German cannon fire over Bremen on the morning of November 29th, 1943. They awarded him the Air Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster for his service with the 8th Air Force, the European Theatre Medal, the Good Conduct Medal. They gave him an honorable discharge on December 1st, 1945. He went home, Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin, the same landscape he had grown up in, the dairy farms and the tree lines and the sky overhead where aircraft had passed when he was a boy, and he had stopped whatever he was doing and watched them until they disappeared. The sky looked the same. The farms looked the same. The roads between them looked the same. He was not the same. He was 21 years old, and he was not the same. He married Margaret Finley within months of his return, a local girl who had known him before the war. She knew the farm boy who had watched aircraft pass overhead and dreamed of flight. She met the man who came home from Germany, and she understood, with the specific intelligence that some people possess about other people, that these were the same person and that the distance between them was something she could help him cross if he would let her. He let her. They built a life on a small farm near Soldiers Grove, the kind of life that does not produce headlines or attract attention, the kind of life that is built from seasons and harvests and children and the accumulated small decisions of 2 people who have decided to face in the same direction. They had 9 children. Moran rarely spoke about the war. Not to Margaret, not to his children as they grew, not to neighbors who asked, and some did ask because the story had circulated in the community during the war years. Fragments of it arriving through official notifications, and the letters of men who had been in the camps with him. He would acknowledge that he had served, and that he had been a prisoner, and that he was home now. Beyond that, the conversation typically moved to something else. The nightmares did not care about his preference for silence. They came in the night with the consistency of the headaches, regularly and without warning, and with a vividness that the waking mind does not have access to. The sound of aluminum tearing itself apart at 24,000 feet. The sight of the front half of his B-17 falling away from him, the cold of the concrete floor, the frozen road. He would wake with the specific physical certainty that he was still there, still in the tail section, still falling, and it would take seconds or minutes for the present to reassert itself and confirm that the room around him was his room, and the woman beside him was his wife, and the year was no longer 1943. Margaret learned to recognize the signs of the nightmares before they fully arrived. She learned what to say and what not to say. She learned the geography of the damage and navigated it with a patience that Moran would not find adequate words for in 6 decades of marriage. He worked the farm. He attended church on Sundays, at the same church his parents had attended, and their parents before them. He watched his children grow into people who had no direct experience of what the world had been when he was their age, and he considered this the best possible outcome. The years went by. His children grew up and had children of their own, and those children grew up. The farm produced what farms produce. The seasons cycled in the way that seasons cycle in Soissons on winters, giving way to springs that always came later than you wanted them to, and summers that were exactly what they needed to be, and autumns that reminded you of why you lived in a place with seasons. The metal plate in his skull produced its headaches for 6 decades. His arms ached in cold weather for 6 decades. These were the permanent facts of his body, the things that November 29th, 1943, had left in him that could not be removed. He lived with them. He outlived most of the men he had been imprisoned with. He outlived most of his fellow gunners from the 96th Bomb Group. He outlived the era in which the war he had fought was living memory rather than history. In 2007, more than 60 years after the morning, over Bremen, the Wisconsin Board of Veterans Affairs created a new recognition, the Veteran Lifetime Achievement Award. They reviewed the records of the men who might qualify, and they chose one man to be the first recipient, Eugene Moran. The ceremony brought reporters. It brought historians. It brought the specific attention that communities pay to things they should have been paying attention to for longer than they had. Moran sat in a chair and received the award and answered questions with the economy of a man who had spent 60 years not talking about this, and was not certain that talking about it now was something he fully understood how to do, but he talked. A local educator named John Armbruster heard him talk and understood that what he was hearing was not a veteran's anecdote, but a historical record that existed nowhere else, in the form it existed in Moran's memory. He began conducting interviews, methodical, patient, over years. He cross-referenced what Moran told him against military records, against German archives, against the testimony of Jesse Orison and the other surviving witnesses to the events of November 29th, 1943. The research confirmed everything. Every detail that could be checked against a document was checked against a document. The mission records of the 96th Bomb Group, the 8th Air Force casualty reports, the German military records of the recovery of Allied airmen in the area south of Bremen in the days following the raid, Orison's official prisoner of war testimony, the records of Stalag Luft 4, the documented history of the Black March. It all aligned. The farm boy from Wisconsin who fell 4 miles from the sky and kept shooting on the way down was not a story that had grown in the telling over 60 years of silence. It was a story that had waited in the silence precisely as it had happened. In 2008, the town of Soldiers Grove did something permanent. They named a street after him, Eugene Moran Way, a road in the community where he was born and where he returned from the war and where he spent the rest of his life. His name on a sign at the corner, permanent in the way that street signs are permanent, which is to say, not forever, but long enough to mean something, while the people who understood what the name meant were still alive to read it. John Armbruster's research became a book, titled Tailspin, a complete account drawn from primary sources, from documents, from the interviews conducted over years with Moran and his family and every living witness who could be found. The record that Moran had not made for himself, made at last by someone who understood that the record needed to exist. Jesse Orison came home from the war and made his testimony and lived his life. His account of what he had seen in the final seconds before he bailed out of the nose section of Rikki Tikki Tavi, the tail gunner still at his position, still firing, as German fighters circled a crippled bomber that was already coming apart around him, became the evidentiary foundation for everything that was documented afterward. Without Orison, there was no witness. Without a witness, there was only a man who claimed to have survived something impossible. With Orison, there was history. Eugene Moran died on March 23rd, 2014. He was 89 years old. 70 years had passed since the morning over Bremen. 70 years since the sound of aluminum tearing itself apart. 70 years since he had grabbed his guns in a falling tail section and kept firing because he was a tail gunner and the tail was his position and he did not know how to stop being what he was, just because the aircraft he was part of no longer existed. His obituary noted a phrase he had used in his later years to describe his approach to the time he had been given after the war. "I would rather wear out than rust out." 7 words. The philosophy of a man who had been given back his life under circumstances that suggested the gift was not to be wasted, who had built a family and worked a farm and lived quietly for 7 decades after the world had done its absolute worst to him and failed. The 96th Bomb Group flew 340 combat missions during the Second World War. They lost 189 aircraft, 938 men killed or captured. Numbers that represent, if you allow yourself to stay with them long enough to feel their weight, a scale of loss that the mind resists, because it is easier to resist it than to fully absorb it. Eugene Moran was one man inside those numbers. A tail gunner, 19 years old. The loneliest position on the aircraft, twin, 50 calibers, and whatever was inside him that was stronger than the cold and the damage and the falling and the years behind the wire and the frozen road, and all of it, everything Germany could bring to bear against a farm boy from Wisconsin, who had watched aircraft pass over his father's land and decided he wanted to be up there. He got up there, and when the aircraft came apart around him at 24,000 feet on a grey November morning over Bremen, Germany, he did not let go of the guns. He kept shooting all the way down. Remember that the next time the world tells you that something is finished, remember the tail gunner who looked at the evidence, that everything was over, and decided that the evidence was wrong. Remember that the distance between being finished and being done is sometimes just the decision to keep your hands on the grips. Eugene Moran made that decision at 24,000 feet. He kept making it for 70 more years.